Somewhere beneath the British Museum, in climate-controlled vaults where humidity holds steady at 45% and temperature never wavers from 18 degrees Celsius, clay tablets rest in archival darkness. They have rested this way for over a century now, since archaeologists pulled them from the buried libraries of ancient Mesopotamia. But these tablets rested far longer before that, nearly 4,000 years beneath the sands of what is now southern Iraq, waiting in the ruins of Nineveh and Nippur and Ur. Pressed into their surfaces in the wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform are stories of divine beings called the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens to walk among humanity. Yet scattered through these ancient texts, fragmentary and strange, are passages that scholars have puzzled over for generations. Passages that speak not of divine triumph, but of divine flight. Warnings of something that pursued these celestial beings across the cosmos. Something that followed them from world to world. Something they could not escape no matter how far they traveled. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most haunting questions embedded in humanity's oldest written records. What could possibly chase gods across the universe? Hello, my friend. I'm genuinely glad you're here. It's probably late where you are, the kind of hour when the world grows quiet and the mind becomes more receptive to ancient things. Thank you for choosing to spend this time together, for settling into whatever comfortable place you've found, for allowing yourself this space where curiosity and rest can coexist. These late hours have always belonged to storytellers and stargazers, and tonight we're going to be a little of both. The Anunnaki present one of archaeology's most fascinating interpretive challenges. In mainstream Sumerian scholarship, these beings represent a pantheon of agricultural and cosmic deities, personifications of natural forces that the ancient Mesopotamians wove into elaborate mythological frameworks. Anu ruled the heavens. Enlil commanded the winds and storms. Enki presided over fresh water and wisdom. Their stories explained why crops grew, why rivers flooded, why civilization itself emerged in the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates. But alternative researchers have long pointed to curious details within these same texts. The Anunnaki are consistently described as arriving from elsewhere, descending from the sky to a world that was not originally their home. Multiple tablets reference previous dwellings, previous attempts at settlement, previous departures. The Sumerian term itself translates roughly as those who from heaven came down, and the texts describe them not as eternal beings, but as travelers with histories, with burdens, with fears. We're not here tonight to settle debates that have occupied scholars for over a century. That's not really possible in a single evening, and honestly, that's not really the point. We're here to sit with questions that have captivated human imagination since the very dawn of writing itself. We're here to explore what these ancient scribes carved into clay, what warnings they preserved, what mysteries they encoded in the oldest literature our species has ever produced. What follows those who believe themselves beyond pursuit? What haunts even the divine? Take a breath with me now. Let your shoulders release whatever tension they've been holding. Where are you tonight? What stars hang above your roof, even if clouds or city lights hide them from view? The same constellations that Sumerian priests tracked from their temple platforms still wheel overhead, unchanged across 5,000 years. Orion still rises. The Pleiades still cluster in their eternal gathering. You're connected to deep time simply by existing beneath this ancient sky. If you find value in what we explore together, a like or subscribe genuinely helps others discover these journeys into forgotten worlds. I'm grateful for every listener who takes that small moment. The clay tablets wait in their museum darkness, patient as only objects of stone and earth can be patient. They have outlasted the empires that created them, the libraries that housed them, the languages that first gave them voice. Cuneiform fell silent for 2,000 years before 19th century scholars began piecing together its secrets once more. And even now, tens of thousands of tablets remain untranslated in storage facilities around the world. What secrets still sleep in that unread archive? What warnings have yet to be decoded? The Sumerians believed that certain knowledge carried weight, that some truths were dangerous simply to possess. They wrote of divine councils debating whether humanity should be taught too much, whether certain information should be shared at all. And they wrote of gods who watch the skies not with wonder, but with vigilance. Beings who had seen what lay between the stars and who understood that distance alone provided no safety. We begin where all Sumerian stories begin, in the time before time had meaning, in the age when the primordial waters had not yet separated into heaven and earth, in the darkness that preceded light itself. Let the tablets speak. Beneath the mounds that local villagers called tells, the accumulated debris of millennia compressed into artificial hills rising from the Iraqi plains, 19th century archaeologists discovered something unprecedented. They found libraries. Not the scattered remnants of a few documents, but vast institutional collections containing tens of thousands of clay tablets, organized and cataloged by ancient librarians who understood that knowledge required preservation. At Nineveh alone, in the ruins of the palace complex built by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal around 650 BCE, excavators recovered over 30,000 tablets and fragments. The king had been obsessive in his collection, sending scribes throughout his empire to copy older texts, to gather the wisdom of civilizations already ancient in his own time. He preserved Sumerian writings that were, even then, 1,500 years old. The scale of these discoveries transformed our understanding of human history. Austin Henry Layard began excavating Nineveh in 1845, shipping crate after crate of inscribed clay back to the British Museum. His assistant, Hormuzd Rassam, continued the work, uncovering the library chambers where tablets still sat on collapsed shelving, buried but intact. At Nippur, a joint expedition from the University of Pennsylvania unearthed the temple archives of Enlil between 1889 and 1900, recovering thousands of religious and administrative texts spanning 2,000 years. At Leonard Woolley's excavations in the 1920s and 1930s revealed not only the famous royal tombs, but also schools where young scribes had practiced their cuneiform, their exercise tablets preserving the very process of learning this complex writing system. Cuneiform itself explains why these records survived when so much else vanished. The Sumerians wrote by pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, creating the wedge-shaped impressions that give the script its name, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. Once dried or fired, these tablets became nearly indestructible. Papyrus rots, parchment burns, even stone erodes under wind and water. But clay tablets buried in dry desert conditions simply wait, unchanged, until someone unearths them again. The very fires that destroyed the libraries of Nineveh actually helped preserve their contents, baking unfired tablets into permanent ceramic. What did these buried libraries contain? Everything. Administrative records tracking grain distributions and livestock counts, legal codes predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries, mathematical tablets demonstrating knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras, astronomical observations precise enough to predict eclipses, medical texts cataloging symptoms and treatments. And woven throughout this practical documentation, the mythological texts that form our focus tonight, stories of creation and flood, of divine hierarchies and cosmic battles, of the beings called Anunnaki. The term itself remains debated among Sumerologists. The most common translation renders it as those who from heaven came down, or princely offspring, derived from the Sumerian words for heaven, lordship, and descent. Some scholars emphasize the celestial origin implied in this etymology. Others argue the term simply denotes nobility or divine status without literal astronomical meaning. The tablets themselves offer no definitive resolution, preserving ambiguity across 4,000 years. This fragmentary nature defines everything we know about Sumerian religion. Tablets break, sections crumble, key passages remain illegible where clay has flaked away or stylus impressions have worn smooth. We read these ancient texts through gaps and guesses, reconstructing meaning from incomplete evidence, always aware that the next excavation might overturn our careful interpretations. The gods emerge from these fragments like figures half glimpsed through fog. Long before the Tigris and Euphrates carved their paths toward the Persian Gulf, before reed marshes sheltered the first human settlements, before anyone had pressed stylus to clay, the Sumerians believed there was only water. Namu, the primordial sea, existed alone in the darkness that preceded creation. She was not a goddess in the way later traditions would understand divinity, not a figure with temples and priests and offerings. She was something older, the fundamental substance from which all existence would eventually emerge. The tablets describe her as the mother who gave birth to heaven and earth, the source without source, the beginning that had no beginning. From Namu came An and Ki, the sky and the Ifro, earth, still joined together in their first moments like lovers unwilling to separate. Their union produced Enlil, the god of wind and storms, and it was Enlil who forced his parents apart, lifting the heavens away from the earth to create the space where life could exist. This cosmic separation appears throughout ancient Near Eastern mythology, echoing in Egyptian accounts of Shu separating Nut and Geb, resonating forward into the Genesis narrative where waters divide from waters. The Sumerians told this story first, inscribing it into clay centuries before other cultures adapted its structure. The universe that emerged from this primordial division was not empty space populated by distant forces. The Sumerians understood their cosmos as alive in ways modern thinking struggles to fully appreciate. Every river possessed consciousness. Every wind carried intention. The earth itself thought and felt and remembered. Gods did not merely influence natural phenomena from some removed celestial throne. They were those phenomena, identical with the forces they represented, yet also somehow separate, able to walk among humans, to speak with human voices, to experience human emotions. Anu dwelt in the highest heavens, remote and powerful, the ultimate authority among divine beings. His name simply meant sky in Sumerian, the identity between God and domain remaining absolute. Enlil commanded the space between heaven and earth, ruling over atmosphere and weather, his breath becoming the winds that brought both gentle rains and devastating storms. Enki, perhaps the most complex figure in the Sumerian pantheon, resided in the Abzu, the freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the Earth's surface. He was wisdom itself, the keeper of the divine decrees, called me that governed all aspects of civilization. These three formed the highest tier of what scholars call the Anunnaki, though the term would eventually encompass a much larger assembly of divine beings. Beneath them stretched an elaborate hierarchy, specialized deities governing everything from brickmaking to brewing, from the growth of barley to the movements of specific planets. The Sumerians populated their universe densely with conscious forces, leaving no natural process unexplained, no phenomenon without its divine administrator. Yet embedded within this elaborate theology lies a curious philosophical tension. These beings possessed tremendous power. They shaped the cosmos, created humanity, established the foundations of civilization itself. But the tablets also describe them debating, disagreeing, sometimes failing. They could be tricked and wounded and imprisoned. If gods could create, could they also fear? The question hangs unanswered in the ancient clay. The tablets do not describe a triumphant arrival. When Sumerian scribes recorded the coming of the Anunnaki to Earth, they chose language that carries undertones of necessity rather than conquest, of settlement rather than dominion. The gods descended, the texts tell us, and immediately began working. They dug canals. They established boundaries. They divided the land into regions and assigned responsibilities among themselves. These were not the actions of beings arriving at a paradise prepared for their pleasure. These were the actions of refugees establishing a new home, of survivors rebuilding what had been lost elsewhere. Consider what the tablets actually describe. In the myth known as Enki and the World Order, composed sometime around 1900 BCE, the god of wisdom travels systematically across the earth, organizing every aspect of existence. He assigns the Tigris and Euphrates to specific divine overseers. He establishes the protocols for agriculture and animal husbandry. He designates which gods will govern which crafts, which cities, which natural phenomena. The level of administrative detail is remarkable, reading almost like the minutes of a planning committee rather than the deeds of omnipotent creators. Enki works within constraints, negotiates between competing divine interests, solves problems that arise from limited resources and conflicting claims. Mainstream Sumerology interprets these narratives as sophisticated allegories for natural and social processes. The gods represent agricultural cycles, seasonal patterns, the organizational structures of early urban civilization projected backward onto cosmic time. The descent from heaven symbolizes the gift of civilization itself, knowledge and order arriving to transform chaotic wilderness into productive human society. This interpretation has substantial scholarly support, fitting the text comfortably within comparative mythology frameworks that trace similar patterns across ancient cultures. Alternative researchers point toward different details. The Anunnaki consistently originate from somewhere else. The term itself, those who from heaven came down, emphasizes movement from one location to another. Multiple texts reference the Anunnaki's previous existence before Earth, describing conditions in their former dwelling that necessitated departure. The Atrahasis epic, one of our oldest flood narratives dating to approximately 1700 BCE, opens with a period when the Anunnaki had divided into two groups, the greater gods and the lesser Igigi, with the Igigi performing exhausting labor that eventually drove them to rebellion. Why would divine beings need to perform labor at all? What task so urgent required such effort? The tablets fragment precisely where we most wish them complete. Passages break off mid-sentence. Key terms remain untranslatable. their meanings lost when the scribal traditions that defined them vanished. We catch glimpses of a larger narrative, references to cosmic events that preceded the descent, allusions to conditions that made previous dwellings untenable. One damaged tablet from Nippur mentions the Anunnaki fleeing somewhere, though the origin point has crumbled away. Another references the place that was abandoned, without specifying what place or why abandonment became necessary. What made elsewhere uninhabitable? What drove divine beings to seek refuge on this small world orbiting an ordinary star? The clay preserves the questions while withholding the answers. Carved into a tablet now housed in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, damaged but still legible after 37 centuries, the god Enki speaks words that trouble translators to this day. The passage appears in a composition scholars call Enki and Ninmah, and at its center lies a curious admission. Enki, the keeper of all wisdom, the holder of the divine decrees that govern civilization, expresses something unexpected. He speaks of knowledge that brings no comfort, of understanding that weighs rather than liberates, of secrets he wishes he had never learned. The exact phrasing remains contested among Sumerologists, but the emotional tone carries clearly across millennia. Even the god of wisdom knew things he would rather forget. This theme of troubled divine knowledge winds through Mesopotamian literature like a dark thread woven into bright fabric. The Epic of Era, composed in Akkadian sometime around 800 BCE, but drawing on far older traditions, presents perhaps the strangest vision of divine behavior in ancient Near Eastern literature. Era, a god of war and pestilence, convinces Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon, to temporarily abandon his temple and his protective duties. During Marduk's absence, Era unleashes devastating violence upon the world. Cities burn, populations scatter, civilization itself trembles. Yet beneath this surface narrative of divine conflict, the text contains peculiar references to cosmic disturbances, to the Anunnaki withdrawing from their posts, to protective barriers failing across the heavens. Scholars interpret this as political allegory, reflecting the chaos of the period when Babylon suffered repeated invasions. Alternative readers see encoded memory of actual celestial events, divine retreats triggered by something the text never fully names. The Atrahasis epic confronts us with an even more disturbing question. This flood narrative, predating the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, describes the gods deliberately deciding to destroy humanity through deluge. Their stated reason seems almost petty. Humanity had become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing divine rest. But reading the full text carefully reveals deeper currents. The gods debate extensively before choosing annihilation. They disagree among themselves. Enki secretly warns the human Atrahasis to build a boat because he cannot bear to see his creation destroyed completely. After the flood recedes, the surviving gods express regret, even grief. They had acted from something resembling panic, making permanent decisions under pressure they could not fully control. Why would gods panic? What pressure could beings of such power not control? The lament literature of ancient Mesopotamia preserves haunting expressions of divine abandonment. When cities fell to invasion, when temples burned, when civilization collapsed in particular regions, scribes composed formal laments in which the patron deities of those places expressed sorrow at departing. The Lament for Ur, composed after that city's destruction around 2000 BCE, describes the goddess Ningal weeping as she leaves her temple, unable to prevent the catastrophe despite her divine status. She pleads with higher gods to spare her city. They refuse or cannot help. She departs. The pattern repeats across texts and centuries. Gods arriving, gods working, gods watching anxiously. Then gods leaving, always leaving, as though departure were inevitable. There is a technique ancient scribes employed when confronting subjects too dangerous to name directly. They wrote around the thing itself, describing its effects without identifying its source, tracing the shadow without acknowledging what cast it. Modern scholars call this circumlocution, the practice of speaking in circles, and Mesopotamian literature contains remarkable examples of deliberate avoidance. The tablets tell us what fled. They describe the act of fleeing. They detail the consequences of flight across cosmic distances. Yet the thing that triggered the flight remains curiously absent, a presence defined entirely by the void where its name should appear. What the Anunnaki feared, they did not write plainly upon clay. The Galu demons offer our closest textual parallel to understanding pursuit that even gods could not escape. These entities appear throughout Sumerian and later Akkadian literature as relentless hunters, beings without mercy or negotiation, forces that could not be bribed or reasoned with or fought. When the goddess Inanna descended to the underworld and was allowed to return, the Galu followed her back to the surface, demanding a substitute for every soul released from death's domain. They seized her husband Dumuzi despite his divine status, dragging him downward while he fled in terror across the Mesopotamian landscape. The texts describe his desperate shape-shifting, his appeals to the sun god Utu for help, his hiding places that always failed. Even a god could not escape what pursued him. Namtar embodied something perhaps more terrifying still. His name translates as Fate Cutter, or that which cuts destiny, and he served as chief minister to Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Namtar did not chase his victims. He simply arrived when their time had come, inevitable as entropy itself. The texts describe him bringing 60 diseases to humanity, each one an expression of inescapable ending. Neither prayer nor offering could deflect his approach. Neither divine favor nor human cleverness provided protection. Namtar represented finality without appeal, the one force before which all other powers ultimately bowed. Alternative researchers have proposed more material interpretations of what might have pursued the Anunnaki across worlds. Ecological collapse appears in multiple ancient flood narratives, waters rising to cleanse what had become unsustainable. Resource depletion echoes through texts describing gods laboring before humanity's creation, struggling with tasks that should have been effortless for omnipotent beings. Some have suggested the Anunnaki fled consequences of their own technologies, weapons or tools that turned against their creators, a theme that resonates uncomfortably with modern anxieties. The Sumerian word for certain divine instruments remains untranslatable, their function described only through metaphor and effect. Perhaps most significant is what the text conspicuously avoid stating. The scribes who recorded divine genealogies with meticulous care, who cataloged every offering and ritual with obsessive precision, who named hundreds of minor deities governing the most obscure phenomena, these same scribes left the pursuer unidentified. The silence feels intentional, as though naming the thing would somehow invoke it, would draw its attention across whatever distances the Anunnaki had hoped would provide safety. Some knowledge, the tablets suggest, carries danger in the very act of recording. Among the most contested terms in all Sumerian scholarship, one word has generated more debate than perhaps any other: Nibiru appears in cuneiform texts spanning nearly 2 millennia, its meaning shifting between contexts in ways that frustrate definitive interpretation. In astronomical tablets from the 1st millennium BCE, Nibiru clearly designates Jupiter, the wandering star that Babylonian priests tracked with remarkable precision across their night skies. In other contexts, the term seems to reference a celestial crossing point, a location where planetary paths intersected the fixed stars. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, composed around 1100 BCE from older Sumerian sources, describes Marduk establishing Nibiru as a cosmic station, a fixed point by which other celestial movements could be measured. Alternative researchers have proposed far more dramatic interpretations. Zecharia Sitchin, whose books reached millions of readers beginning in 1976, argued that Nibiru represented an actual planet with an elongated orbit, homeworld of the Anunnaki, returning to the inner solar system at intervals of approximately 3,600 years. Mainstream Sumerologists have thoroughly critiqued Sitchin's translations, demonstrating numerous errors in his rendering of cuneiform texts. Yet the popular fascination with his theories reveals something genuine, a hunger to find meaning in ancient records that transcends purely mythological interpretation. What the tablets actually describe remains strange enough without embellishment. The Enuma Elish presents a cosmic geography spanning 7 tablets, each containing between 115 and 170 lines of text. The narrative describes the universe before Earth existed, when primordial beings warred among themselves, when cosmic order emerged through violent struggle. The Anunnaki appear as an assembly, a collective whose members receive stations throughout the heavens, 300 placed in the sky and 300 assigned to the underworld. These stations carry administrative functions, overseeing different aspects of cosmic operation. Whether they represent abstract mythological concepts or something more literal remains perpetually unclear. The pattern embedded within these texts deserves careful attention. Divine beings arrive at a location. They establish order from chaos. They build, organize, create systems of governance and production. They flourish for a time, their civilization reaching heights of achievement. Then something changes. The texts describe departure, destruction, or the necessity of moving elsewhere. This sequence repeats across multiple compositions from different periods and cities, templates suggesting either common mythological structure or shared memory of actual events. Scholarly consensus holds that these patterns reflect universal human experiences projected onto cosmic scales. Civilizations rise and fall. Populations migrate when conditions deteriorate. The Sumerians encoded these observations into their religious narratives, creating myths that explained why change was inevitable even for gods. The alternative perspective suggests the consistency of these patterns across disconnected textual traditions indicates transmission of genuine historical memory, accounts of real events stripped of context through millennia of copying and recopying. Earth, in either reading, was not the first attempt. The tablets hint at previous settlements, previous departures, previous worlds where the Anunnaki built and flourished and ultimately fled. This world we inhabit may simply be the latest refuge in a much longer journey, one station among many in a pattern that continues still. The question lingers, continues toward what end? The Sumerian king list begins with a statement that has puzzled scholars since its first translation in the early 20th century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the ancient scribe wrote, the kingship was in Eridu. What follows defies conventional historical understanding. The list names 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, their combined reigns totaling 241,200 years. Alulim of Eridu governed for 28,800 years. Alaljar, his successor, reigned for 36,000. The numbers seem impossible, absurd even, yet the scribes recorded them with the same administrative precision they applied to grain inventories and temple offerings. They were not composing fantasy. They were preserving records they believed accurate. 5 cities rose before the waters came: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak. Each served specific functions within the antediluvian civilization. Each received its own divine patron. Each represented a node in the network the Anunnaki established across the Mesopotamian plain. The king list tracks rulership moving between these cities across those impossible millennia, suggesting not isolated settlements, but an integrated system, a civilization operating according to plans laid down in the earliest period of divine-human coexistence. Archaeological excavation at Eridu has revealed something remarkable. Beneath the ziggurat ruins that tourists occasionally visit lies layer upon layer of human habitation, extending downward through time. The site shows continuous occupation beginning around 5,400 BCE, making it among the oldest permanently settled locations anywhere on Earth. The earliest levels contain small shrines built of mud brick, simple structures that subsequent generations enlarged and rebuilt, each new temple constructed directly atop its predecessor. 18 distinct building phases have been identified, spanning 3,000 years of religious continuity at a single sacred location. The Sumerians themselves remembered Eridu as the first city, the place where civilization began, where the god Enki established his temple before humanity fully existed. What relationship bound the Anunnaki to these early cities? The text describes something more intimate than simple worship. The gods did not merely receive offerings from distant devotees. They dwelt within the temple complexes, present and accessible, guiding the development of human society through direct interaction. Enki taught the arts of civilization from his temple at Eridu. Utu dispensed justice from his seat at Sipar. The antediluvian period represented an age of divine proximity, when the boundary between human and divine remained permeable, when gods walked openly among their creations. Then came the flood, and everything changed. The purpose of the deluge varies between textual accounts. The Atrahasis epic frames it as population control, the gods disturbed by human noise and numbers. The Sumerian flood story emphasizes divine caprice, a decision made in assembly that Enki circumvented through clever warning. Some scholars read the flood as mythologized memory of actual catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia, geological evidence suggesting significant inundation events around 2,900 BCE. Alternative interpretations propose the flood narrative encodes deliberate civilizational reset, a controlled destruction that allowed new patterns to emerge. After the waters receded, the kingship descended from heaven once more. But the impossibly long reigns had ended forever. Imagine waking in the city of Nippur around 2100 BCE, during the third dynasty of Ur, when Sumerian civilization reached its final flourishing. The great ziggurat of Enlil rises above the mud brick houses, its terraced levels climbing toward heaven in the pale morning light. You know with complete certainty that the god dwells within that structure, not symbolically or abstractly, but actually present in the dark inner sanctuary where only the highest priests may enter. The air carries smoke from the morning offerings, roasted grain and the fat of sacrificed animals, rising toward divine nostrils that genuinely savor such gifts. The boundary between human and divine is not a matter of faith. It is simply how the universe operates, as obvious as sunlight and as reliable as the flooding of the rivers. This was life during the golden age of divine presence. The gifts the Anunnaki brought to humanity transformed existence itself. Writing emerged from the temple complexes, initially as accounting systems tracking offerings and distributions, eventually evolving into the medium that preserved poetry, law, and the very myths we examine tonight. Astronomical observation reached sophisticated levels that still impress modern scientists. Mesopotamian priests tracking the movements of Venus with accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for 3,000 years. Mathematics developed using a base 60 system whose legacy survives in our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. Agriculture expanded through irrigation networks so complex that they required divine wisdom to design, canals feeding fields that turned desert into the most productive farmland of the ancient world. At the center of this transmission stood the concept the Sumerians called me. These divine decrees governed every aspect of civilized existence. Over 100 distinct me cataloged in various texts, including kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, sexual intercourse, the art of metalworking, the craft of the scribe. The me were not abstract principles, but something closer to cosmic patents, original templates from which all earthly manifestations derived. The gods possessed the me and allocated them to humanity in measured portions, retaining ultimate ownership while permitting borrowed use. The myth of Inanna and Enki describes the goddess acquiring the me through a drinking contest, carrying them back to her city of Uruk in her heavenly boat, a tale of divine technology, transfer embedded in theological narrative. Daily life operated in the shadow of this divine proximity. Offerings arrived at the temples 3 times daily, elaborate meals prepared as though the gods would physically consume them, which worshippers believed they did in their own divine manner. Priests listened for divine messages in the patterns of oil on water, in the configurations of animal entrails, in the shapes of smoke rising from altars. Personal gods attach themselves to individuals like guardian spirits, interceding with greater powers on behalf of their human charges. The universe pulsed with conscious intention at every level. To live in such a world was to feel accompanied, watched, protected by forces that knew your name and cared about your fate. That golden proximity would not last forever. Before humanity existed, the gods performed all labor themselves. This detail appears so consistently across Mesopotamian texts that scholars consider it a foundational element of Sumerian theology, not an incidental narrative flourish, but a core belief about cosmic history. The Anunnaki, those great gods who had descended from heaven and established the first civilizations, assigned the actual work of maintenance to lesser divine beings called the Igigi. For 40 years in divine reckoning, the Igigi dug canals, hauled materials, dredged waterways. They worked without rest in conditions the texts describe as exhausting, even for immortal beings. The Atrahasis epic preserves what happened next. The Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil at night, torches blazing, voices raised in collective refusal. The scene reads remarkably like a labor strike, complete with negotiations, demands, and eventual compromise. Enlil initially responded with confusion, then fear, sending messengers to determine which god had instigated the uprising. The Assembly of Great Anunnaki convened in crisis session, debating how to restore cosmic order without the workforce that had maintained it. The solution came from Enki, ever the problem solver among the divine council. Create something new, he proposed. Create beings who would bear the burdens the Igigi had rejected. Thus, humanity entered existence as a solution to divine labor shortages. The goddess Ninmah shaped the first humans from clay mixed with divine blood, the latter ingredient providing that spark of consciousness that distinguishes us from mere animated matter. Enki supervised the process, contributing wisdom to the design. The texts describe multiple attempts, some producing flawed prototypes that could not work effectively, others creating beings with physical limitations the gods had not intended. Even divine craftwork required refinement. Even gods made mistakes. This vulnerability pervades Sumerian theological literature in ways that distinguish it from later religious traditions. The Anunnaki could be deceived. Enki regularly tricked other gods, sometimes for benevolent purposes, sometimes for reasons the texts leave unexplained. Gods could be wounded in combat, their divine blood spilling during cosmic battles. Inanna was killed during her descent to the underworld. Her corpse hung on a hook for 3 days before Enki's intervention restored her. Marduk spent time imprisoned, though the circumstances remain fragmentary in surviving texts. Enlil himself was exiled briefly for assaulting the goddess Ninlil, suggesting even the chief executive of heaven operated under laws he could not simply override. What does it mean that those who shaped us also experienced fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty? The philosophical implications troubled ancient theologians and trouble modern readers still. If gods require labor, they cannot perform themselves. Divinity begins to resemble a different order of existence rather than omnipotence. If gods can disagree about fundamental decisions, cosmic governance becomes politics rather than pure providence. If gods watch the skies anxiously, scanning for signs of approaching threat, then heaven itself offers no final safety. The beings who created humanity may have done so partly from need, partly from hope, partly from desperation. We were solution and distraction and perhaps something else entirely. The priests of ancient Mesopotamia watched the sky with an intensity modern astronomers might recognize, but for entirely different reasons. Night after night, year after year, century after century, they recorded the movements of celestial bodies with meticulous precision, cataloging positions and patterns that accumulated into the most comprehensive astronomical archive of the ancient world. Tablets from the first millennium BCE preserve observations of Venus spanning 21 years without interruption, tracking the planet's appearances and disappearances, its wanderings against the fixed stars, its brightness fluctuations through different phases. The accuracy achieved without telescopes or sophisticated instruments remains impressive by any standard. Measurements precise enough that modern scholars can calculate exact dates from the celestial configurations recorded. But these priests were not pursuing scientific knowledge in any modern sense. They were watching for warnings. The omen literature of ancient Mesopotamia fills thousands of tablets, systematic collections correlating celestial events with earthly consequences. If Venus appears in a particular constellation during a particular month, the king will die. If the moon shows a certain coloration at a specific phase, flood will devastate the crops. If planets conjoin in certain configurations, divine favor withdraws from the land. The connections seem arbitrary to modern readers, yet the underlying logic reveals something profound about Mesopotamian cosmology. The heavens and earth formed a single interconnected system. Changes above necessarily produced changes below. The gods communicated through celestial signs, and wise observers could read those communications before their earthly effects manifested. The Anunnaki themselves tracked these same patterns, according to the texts. Shamash, the sun god, traveled his prescribed course daily, but his movements carried meaning beyond mere illumination. Sin, the moon god, waxed and waned according to divine schedules that encoded cosmic information. The 7 wandering stars we call planets, visible to naked eye observers and distinguished from fixed stars by their complex apparent motions, each carried divine identity and divine intention. Mesopotamian priests believed they were reading the moods and movements of actual beings, not merely calculating orbital mechanics. When the sky changed, something among the Anunnaki had shifted. Great cycles structured this celestial drama. The conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn occurs approximately every 20 years, both planets appearing close together in the night sky before separating on their endless orbital paths. Mesopotamian astronomers tracked these conjunctions with particular attention, correlating them with political transitions and divine interventions across centuries of accumulated data. Longer cycles emerged from their observations, periods of roughly 60 years when planetary patterns repeated, longer still when deeper resonances aligned. Some texts hint that the Anunnaki arrived and departed according to these cosmic schedules, their presence on Earth synchronized with celestial configurations that marked safe passage or necessary withdrawal. The gods did not simply choose when to come and go. They operated within constraints imposed by forces larger than themselves, timing their movements to windows of opportunity that opened and closed according to patterns written in the stars themselves. The heavens were not merely observed, they were anxiously monitored for what approached. Beneath the surface world where humans built their cities and tended their fields, beneath even the freshwater Abzu, where Enki kept his temple of wisdom, the Sumerians believed another realm existed. They called it Kur, a word that meant both mountain and underworld in their language, the two concepts merging into a single vision of dark depths beyond mortal reach. This was not hell in any later theological sense, not a place of punishment for sinners or reward for the righteous. Kur was simply where all beings eventually went, divine and human alike, a shadowy continuation of existence stripped of joy, warmth, and light. What dwelt in that darkness commanded respect even from the highest Anunnaki. Ereshkigal ruled the great below as its undisputed queen, and her authority extended over territories no other god could claim. When her sister Inanna descended to challenge that rule, the most powerful goddess of the upper world found herself systematically stripped of all protection. At each of the 7 gates leading downward, Inanna surrendered one element of her divine regalia, her crown at the first gate, her measuring rod and line at the second, her necklace of lapis lazuli at the third. By the time she reached Ereshkigal's throne room, Inanna stood naked and powerless, reduced to something less than the goddess she had been above. The judges of the underworld fixed upon her the eyes of death. Ereshkigal hung her corpse on a hook like a piece of rotting meat. Even gods could not escape the claims of the deep. The philosophical implications of this mythology carry remarkable weight. The Sumerians conceived of forces that transcended their own divine hierarchy, powers that operated according to rules even the Anunnaki could not override. Namtar, Ereshkigal's minister, executed fate without negotiation. The Galu demons pursued their quarry without mercy or exception. The underworld represented not simply death, but a fundamental limit on divine power, a boundary beyond which even cosmic authority could not extend. The beings who shaped the heavens and established civilization operated within constraints imposed by something older and more absolute than themselves. Some scholars interpret Kur as psychological metaphor, the underworld representing unconscious forces, death as transformation, Inanna's descent as initiatory journey. These readings carry validity within certain frameworks, but the texts themselves present the underworld with startling literalness, describing its geography in concrete terms, its 7 walls and 7 gates, its rivers of cold water, its dust-covered inhabitants eating clay and dressed in feathers like birds. The Sumerians experienced their underworld as actual place, dreaded destination, inevitable future. The Anunnaki feared what dwelt below, not because they invented those fears for human consumption, but because certain things exceeded even divine control. Entropy claimed all systems eventually. Endings came regardless of power or wisdom or preparation. The deep waited with patience beyond mortal comprehension, knowing that everything descended toward it eventually, knowing that time itself served its purposes. Perhaps what pursued the Anunnaki across worlds was simply this: the understanding that no distance provided permanent escape from what waits in the deep. The me present, one of the most fascinating puzzles in Sumerian studies. Objects that seem to exist simultaneously as abstract concepts and physical artifacts. When Inanna acquired the me from Enki during their famous drinking contest, she loaded them onto her boat and physically transported them to Uruk. The texts describe her cargo in concrete terms, listing over 100 distinct me, including kingship, godship, the throne of rule, the exalted scepter, truth, descent into the underworld, the craft of the smith, the art of song. These were not merely ideas Inanna learned or permission she received. She carried them as objects, defended them against pursuit, and installed them in her temple where they conferred actual power upon her city. What exactly were these things? Mainstream scholarship interprets the me as symbolic representations of civilizational elements, their physical transport serving as narrative device to explain how different cities acquired different cultural institutions. The me represented divine authorization, cosmic patents granting legitimate practice of various arts and offices. Their physicality in the myths reflects the concrete Sumerian understanding of abstract concepts, a tendency to embody ideas in tangible form. This interpretation accounts adequately for most textual evidence, while remaining consistent with comparative mythology frameworks. Alternative researchers have proposed more literal readings. The me, in this view, might represent actual technological or information storage, devices, containers of knowledge that could be transferred between locations and users. The specificity of their listing, the care taken in their transport, the power they conferred upon possession, all suggest something more substantial than mere symbolism. Whether crystalline storage media, genetic material, or technologies beyond modern categorization, the me in this interpretation were tools the Anunnaki brought from elsewhere and distributed strategically across human civilization. Other divine instruments appear throughout Mesopotamian literature, with similarly ambiguous characteristics. Ninurta wielded a weapon called Sharur, whose name translates as smasher of thousands, and the texts describe it not merely as armament, but as companion. Sharur spoke to Ninurta, provided counsel during battle, flew independently to scout enemy positions, and returned with intelligence reports. The weapon possessed something resembling consciousness, engaging in dialogue preserved across multiple compositions. Enlil commanded a brilliance called Melamu that overwhelmed enemies with radiant terror, an emanation that surrounded him like visible aura, capable of projection across distances. The Tablets of Destiny, when held by any being, conferred supreme authority over cosmic operations, control so complete that even the mightiest gods sought their possession. The troubling pattern emerges when reading certain fragmentary texts from later periods. Divine instruments malfunction. Weapons turn against former wielders. Powers once commanded begin operating according to their own imperatives. A damaged tablet from Assur describes what translators render tentatively as the tools remembering their first purpose. Language suggesting technologies with embedded directives that eventually superseded user intentions. Did the Anunnaki create instruments they could not ultimately control? Did their own technologies become part of what pursued them? The fragments offer hints, but no conclusions. Broken clay preserving questions without answers. In a place the Sumerians called Ubshu Ukin-Na, the divine assembly gathered to determine the fate of worlds. This cosmic courtyard appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as the venue where Anunnaki debated matters too significant for individual decision, a celestial parliament where even the mightiest gods submitted their positions to collective deliberation. Here Marduk received authorization to battle Tiamat. Here the flood was decreed over Enki's objections. Here the great decisions that shaped human history emerged from divine discourse, preserved in fragmentary cuneiform across dozens of tablets scattered through museum collections worldwide. The debates were not always harmonious. Enlil and Enki represented opposing philosophies that surface repeatedly throughout Sumerian theological literature. Enlil, Lord of the Wind and Chief Executive of the Divine Assembly, tended toward decisive action and harsh judgment. When humanity grew too numerous and too noisy, Enlil advocated annihilation through flood. When divine resources ran short, Enlil favored reducing the burden by reducing the dependence. His perspective prioritized cosmic order and divine comfort, treating humanity as useful creation that had become inconvenient. The tablets portray him as stern administrator, powerful beyond measure, yet strangely anxious about threats to his authority and position. Enki offered consistent counterbalance. The god of wisdom and fresh waters argued for preservation, for cleverness over force, for solutions that maintained rather than destroyed. He warned Atrahasis secretly, circumventing the assembly's flood decree through technically permissible means. He created humanity in the first place and seemed to feel responsibility for his creations that Enlil did not share. When debates turned toward abandonment or destruction, Enki advocated alternatives, bought time, maneuvered within divine politics to protect what he had made. These debates intensified in later textual periods. Akkadian compositions from the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE describe divine councils deliberating not merely about humanity's fate, but about the Anunnaki's own uncertain future. The Epic of Era portrays gods abandoning their posts, withdrawing protection from cities they had guarded for centuries. Marduk himself leaves Babylon, and his absence permits catastrophe. The texts frame these departures variously as temporary absences, as strategic retreats, as abandonment forced by circumstances the narratives never fully explain. Human worshippers noticed. The lament literature of ancient Mesopotamia preserves some of the most poignant religious poetry ever composed, communities crying out to gods who no longer answered. How long will you be angry? one text demands of departed divinity. The city has become a stranger to you, another mourns. The lament for Ur describes the goddess Ningal, unable to prevent destruction despite her desperate appeals to the divine assembly. She departs weeping, and her city falls. The pattern across centuries of textual evidence traces gradual withdrawal. Gods who once walked openly among humans retreated first to inner sanctuaries, then to occasional visitations, then to silence. Temples continued receiving offerings, but the presence within grew less certain, more distant, harder to perceive. Whether the Anunnaki debated departure and chose to leave, or whether departure was forced upon them, the human experience remained the same. The gods grew silent, and we were left alone. We arrive now at the central question that has drawn us through these hours together, the mystery embedded in fragmentary clay that scholars and seekers have pondered for over a century. What pursued the Anunnaki across worlds? What force could drive divine beings from settlement after settlement, planet after planet, until they arrived on this small world orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy? The honest answer is that we do not know. But several interpretations deserve consideration, each illuminating different aspects of the textual evidence, each carrying its own implications for how we understand these ancient records. Mainstream Sumerology offers the most conservative reading. The Anunnaki represent anthropomorphized natural forces, deities embodying agricultural cycles, celestial movements, and the organizational structures of early urban civilization. Their arrivals and departures reflect seasonal patterns, the waxing and waning of natural phenomena that ancient observers personified into narrative form. The pursuit motif expresses universal human awareness of mortality and entropy, forces that claim even the mightiest powers eventually. In this interpretation, no literal pursuer exists. The texts encode psychological and ecological truths in mythological language, truths about impermanence, about the inevitable decline of all systems, about humanity's anxious relationship with forces beyond our control. This scholarly perspective has substantial merit, fitting the evidence within established frameworks of comparative religion and ancient Near Eastern studies. Alternative researchers propose more literal interpretations. The Anunnaki, in this view, were extraterrestrial beings whose advanced civilization faced catastrophic threats requiring repeated relocation. Resource depletion on their homeworld Nibiru, if such a planet exists, might have initiated their cosmic migrations. Ecological collapse, perhaps self-inflicted through technological overreach, could explain why settlements failed and departures became necessary. Some have suggested cosmic catastrophe, perhaps a destabilizing orbit or stellar event, forced evacuation across vast distances. The texts in this reading preserve genuine historical memory, stripped of context through millennia of oral transmission and scribal copying. The pursuit becomes literal flight from material conditions, not metaphorical exploration of abstract concepts. A third interpretation focuses on the Galu and similar entities as representing something more fundamental than either natural force or physical threat. These demonic pursuers might embody entropy itself, the universe's tendency toward dissolution that no amount of power or wisdom can ultimately resist. The Anunnaki fled not a specific enemy, but the nature of existence, the inescapable truth that all organized systems eventually disperse, all patterns eventually dissolve, all consciousness eventually fades. This cosmological reading positions the pursuit as philosophical rather than literal, yet no less real for its abstraction. Perhaps most troubling is the self-inflicted wound theory. The Anunnaki may have fled consequences of their own actions, technologies that turned against them, wars that devastated their worlds, forbidden knowledge that corrupted what it touched. The texts hint at divine regret, at wisdom that burdened rather than liberated, at powers that proved impossible to control once unleashed. We hold these interpretations gently, neither dismissing nor asserting certainty about any. The clay preserves questions. The answers remain our own to seek. The Sumerian narratives we have explored do not exist in isolation. Across cultures separated by vast distances and centuries of independent development, remarkably similar stories emerge. Accounts of divine beings who descended from celestial realms, taught humanity the arts of civilization, flourished for a time among their creations, then departed under circumstances that suggest flight rather than choice. These parallels have fascinated scholars and alternative researchers alike, raising questions about whether such consistency reflects universal psychological archetypes, diffusion of stories through ancient trade networks, or something more startling, shared memory of actual events preserved independently across multiple traditions. The Book of Enoch, composed in stages between the 3rd century BCE and 1st century CE, describes beings called the Watchers, who descended from heaven to Mount Hermon in the land of Canaan. These celestial entities taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy and cosmetics and astronomy and the arts of war, gifts that proved destructive rather than beneficial. They took human wives and produced offspring called Nephilim, giants who devastated the earth until divine judgment became necessary. The parallels with Anunnaki narratives are striking: divine descent, knowledge transmission, catastrophic consequences, ultimate departure. The Watchers fled divine punishment, pursued by archangels commanded to bind them in darkness until the final judgment. Greek mythology preserves its own account of divine beings overcome by forces greater than themselves. The Titans ruled during a golden age before the Olympian gods rose against them. Cosmic war, devastating the heavens until Zeus and his siblings achieved victory. The defeated Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus, a realm as deep below Hades as Earth lies below heaven, bound in darkness that would last for eternity. Some escaped this fate through submission or cunning, but the pattern remains consistent. An older generation of divine beings, powerful beyond human comprehension, fell to something they could not ultimately resist. Hindu cosmology offers perhaps the most sophisticated articulation of divine withdrawal through its concept of yugas, vast cycles of time during which divine presence waxes and wanes according to cosmic rhythm. During the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, gods walked openly among humanity and righteousness prevailed. Each subsequent age brought increasing divine distance, decreasing virtue, shorter human lifespans, greater suffering. We currently inhabit the Kali Yuga, the dark age of maximum separation from divine presence, a period that will eventually end, in dissolution before the cycle begins anew. The gods have not fled permanently, but have withdrawn according to patterns embedded in the structure of existence itself. Egyptian tradition describes Ra, the supreme solar deity, ruling directly over humanity during a primordial period before withdrawing to the heavens after growing weary of human ingratitude and rebellion. He appointed Thoth to govern in his absence and ascended beyond direct involvement with earthly affairs. The departure was voluntary yet final, a divine choice to abandon close supervision of human development. The pattern repeats across continents and millennia. Gods arrive, gods teach, gods flourish among us for a time. Then gods depart, leaving humanity to continue alone, carrying fragments of transmitted knowledge into uncertain futures. The knowledge survived through chains of transmission that span nearly 5,000 years, each link preserving fragments while losing others, each generation of scribes copying what they received while adapting it to their own contexts and concerns. Sumerian civilization declined after 2000 BCE, its cities falling to Amorite invasions, its language fading from spoken use into the preserved medium of religious and scholarly texts. But Babylonian scribes continued copying Sumerian compositions, treating them as sacred inheritance too valuable to abandon. Assyrian scholars maintained the tradition further, Ashurbanipal's great library at Nineveh representing the culmination of this preservation effort, tens of thousands of tablets gathered specifically to prevent ancient wisdom from vanishing entirely. Then Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, and cuneiform itself began its long descent into silence. For over 2,000 years, no living person could read these texts. The wedge-shaped impressions on clay tablets became mysterious decorations, their meaning utterly lost. Travelers who encountered inscriptions at Persepolis and Babylon copied them as curiosities, without comprehension. The entire literary tradition of humanity's earliest civilization lay mute, waiting for someone to recover the key. That key emerged from a cliff face in western Iran. The Behistun inscription, carved around 520 BCE by order of the Persian king Darius, presented the same text in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Henry Rawlinson, a British Army officer, spent years during the 1830s and 1840s copying this inscription while suspended by ropes hundreds of feet above the ground. His work, combined with efforts by Edward Hincks, Jules Oppert, and others, gradually cracked the cuneiform code. By the 1850s, scholars could read Babylonian texts. By the 1870s, Sumerian itself began yielding its secrets, though translation work continues to this day with ongoing refinements and revisions. The tablets speak again, but much remains unheard. Estimates suggest that over 500,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments reside in museum collections worldwide, and perhaps only a tenth have received full scholarly translation. Storage facilities in London, Philadelphia, Berlin, Baghdad, and dozens of other institutions contain boxes of inscribed clay that no modern eye has carefully studied. The Anunnaki narratives we have explored tonight represent a fraction of what exists, themselves fragmentary, damaged, missing crucial sections that might illuminate questions we cannot currently answer. What does this legacy offer those of us who seek connection with deep time? Perhaps most importantly, it offers humility. These ancient scribes preserved mysteries they could not solve, encoding questions into imperishable clay with full awareness that answers might never come. They trusted future generations to continue seeking, to value the questions themselves as inheritance worth protecting. We received their gift across 5 millennia, no closer to certainty, but enriched by the seeking itself. The tablets preserve not answers, but the shape of ancient wonder. They remind us that humanity has always lived in mystery, has always looked toward the heavens with questions too large for final resolution. This too is legacy. This too survives. Let the ancient world recede now, gently. Like tide withdrawing from a shore, it will return to touch again. The temples and ziggurats, the scribes bent over wet clay in lamplight, the priest watching Venus rise above mud brick walls, all of this settles back into the depths of time from which we briefly summoned it. The questions remain, but they no longer require your attention tonight. They have waited 4,000 years already. They will wait while you rest. Return now to the simple truth of where you are. Feel the surface beneath you, supporting your weight without effort, asking nothing in return. Notice the temperature of the air against your skin, the slight movements of breath that continue without your conscious direction. Your body knows how to rest. It has always known. You are simply giving it permission now, releasing the gentle tension of attention that listening requires, allowing yourself to settle more deeply into stillness with each slow exhale. The same stars shine above your roof that Sumerian priests tracked from their temple platforms 5,000 years ago. Orion still rises in his season. The Pleiades still cluster in their eternal gathering. Venus still wanders her complex path against the fixed constellations, bright enough to cast faint shadows on clear nights, unchanged across all the centuries of human watching. Whatever pursued the Anunnaki across worlds, whatever drove them from settlement to settlement until they arrived here and eventually departed, those same stars witnessed it. They witness you now, resting in this small moment of peace, connected to deep time simply by existing beneath their ancient light. We did not solve the mystery tonight. That was never truly possible, and perhaps not even desirable. Some questions exist not to be answered, but to be inhabited, spaces of wonder that expand the spirit simply through contemplation. What chased the Anunnaki off every world they settled? The honest answer remains, we do not know. But we have sat with the question together, traced its contours through fragmentary texts and competing interpretations, allowed ourselves to feel the weight of 4 millennia pressing upward from buried libraries into our present awareness. The clay tablets rest in their museum darkness even now, patient as only objects of earth can be patient. They hold their whispers for those who will listen in ages yet to come, future seekers who will bring their own questions to the ancient clay and find their own fragmentary answers. The chain of transmission continues through you, through this night of listening, through the wondering that will perhaps surface in dreams or quiet moments in the days ahead. You are part of this great continuity now, one more consciousness touching the mystery before passing it forward. Let yourself drift like a cuneiform sign pressed softly into the clay of night, held in place by forces that require no effort from you, preserved in the stillness that underlies all things. The Anunnaki watched these same stars and wondered at their fate. You watch them now and wonder at yours. The wondering connects you across time, makes you kin to every seeker who has ever looked upward and asked what moves in the darkness between lights. Rest now. The mystery keeps itself. Sleep well, my friend. The stars remember everything, and they will still be there when you wake.